Hello and welcome back to Neo Psychology with me, your teacher, Mr. Neo, the channel where I teach online psychology lessons for my wonderful students. Today we're continuing with the unit of social influence and we're looking at lesson 4, obedience, Milgram's research in 1963. Let's get started. Here's a starter. If a teacher set you homework, would you complete it? If a teacher gave you a detention, would you go? If a teacher asked you to hit another student, would you comply? These are some interesting questions when we look at the topic of obedience. Stanley Milgram sought an answer to the question of why such a high proportion of the German population obeyed Hitler's commands to murder over 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, as well as 5 million Romani, homosexuals, black Germans, Poles, and members of other social groups during the Second World War. He thought one possible explanation was that Germans were different from people from other countries. Perhaps German people were just more obedient. In order to determine this, he needed a procedure which could assess how obedient people are. I recommend watching this video of Milgram's obedience study. It'll give you a much better insight into what's going on. It's some great knowledge, it's a great video, watch it. How far would you go? Let's have a look at our learning objectives. We're going to look at Stanley Milgram's obedience study procedures, the findings, and again we're going to discuss and evaluate Milgram's obedience study. Let's start with the procedures. Stanley Milgram recruited 40 American male participants supposedly for a study of memory. Each participant arrived at Milgram's lab and drew lots for their role. A Confederate, Mr. Wallace, was always the learner, while the true participant, or the naive, or the actual real participant, was the teacher. An experimenter, another Confederate, so another researcher part of the research study, wore a lab coat. So you can see in the little GIF there, the experimenter is in a lab coat on the left, tall. Mr. Wallace, I believe, is the guy on the left. He got learner, and the guy on the right, actually I think it's the other way around. The guy on the left is the teacher, who's the real naive participant, and the guy on the right is Mr. Wallace, the learner. So let's have a look at the procedure. The teacher could hear but not see the learner. So the learner is L, the teacher is T, and E is the experimenter. The learner, Mr. Wallace, was strapped into a chair in a separate room and wired with electrodes. The teacher had to give the learner an increasingly severe electric shock each time he made a mistake on a task. So the teacher had to give the learner electric shocks every time they got a question wrong. The learner's task was to remember word pairs. The teacher delivered shocks by pressing switches on a shock machine, labelled from slight shock, and it tells you how many volts, 15 volts, to dangerous severe shock XXX, up to 450 volts. The shocks increased in 14 volt steps up to 450 volts. The shocks were fake, but the shock machine was labelled to make them look increasingly severe. If the teacher wished to stop giving the electric shocks and stop the experimenter gave a sequence of 4 standardized verbal prods to continue. So, if I'm gonna play both characters here. Let's say I'm the teacher. I'm going, I don't want to continue with this experiment. The experimenter would say, please continue, or please go on. Okay? I would say, but I'm not comfortable giving this person electric shocks. The researcher, the experimenter would say, the experiment requires that you continue. I'm really not comfortable continuing. It's absolutely essential that you continue. I would like to leave the experiment. I don't want to take part anymore. You have no other choice. You must go on. Those were the standardized prods. Only if they said a fifth time, I don't want to be part of this experiment, please let me leave the experiment, did they allow them to withdraw from the experiment. So, this is a study on obedience, but what is obedience? Okay? What is obedience? Fill in the gaps, give it a go, 2 minutes, write your answer now. Obedience is a form of social influence in which an individual follows a direct order. The person issuing the order is usually a figure of authority who has the power to punish when obedient behavior is not forthcoming. So that's what obedience is. It's a form of social influence in which an individual follows a direct order. The person issuing the order is usually a figure of authority who has the power to punish when obedient behavior is not forthcoming. And that's Milgram's obedience study procedure. Can you identify one thing you learned about Milgram's studies procedure? Why do you think learning about this is important? What was the hardest part of this? And what questions has this raised for you? That's the procedure, right? Remember, there could be a question that says outline Milgram's obedience study procedure, or it could say outline Milgram's obedience study findings. There's a difference there. Let's have a look at the findings. What do you think Milgram found? What percent of the participants stopped at 300 volts, and what participants continued to the highest level of 450 volts? What do you reckon? Remember, it started at 15 up to 450. What percent stopped at 300 volts? 12.5%. What percent of the participants continued to 450 volts? 65%. A massive amount. Experts who saw this study predicted maybe 2, 3, 4, 5% of people would go all the way to the top. They'd be like, no, people won't randomly give people severe electric shocks just because somebody's asking of them. No, that's not true. 65% of participants continue to give electric shocks to the highest level. Severe shocks that would in reality potentially kill someone. They could be fatal. Participants showed extreme signs of tension, sweating, trembling, biting lips, stuttering, and digging their fingernails into their hands. These participants didn't want to give these highest level of blows. They weren't just there pressing the buzzers, bzz, 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 no problem. They weren't happy with it. They didn't want to be given electric shocks, right? But they were doing it because they were obeying. They were obeying the authority figure, which was the experimenter in the lab coat. Before the study, Milgram asked 14 psychology students to predict how they thought the naive participants would respond. The students estimated no more than 3% would continue to 450 volts. So the baseline findings were very unexpected. After the study, participants were debriefed, okay? They were told about what the true experiments, what the true aims of the experiment were about. Follow-up questionnaires showed 84% were glad that they had participated. So Milgram's covering his back there. He's saying that most of the people actually enjoyed being part of the study. What can we conclude from this? We can conclude that we obey legitimate authority even if that means that our behavior causes harm to somebody else. We obey authority. Certain situational factors like proximity, location, and uniform encourage obedience, and we're going to discuss that next lesson. So, if we look back to the example, were the Germans just more obedient than any other nation, and that's why these people committed these atrocious acts during World War II? No. It turns out that everyone, a lot of people, according to the research, 65% of the people obeyed to the point where they were willing to give 450 volts worth of shocks to random strangers, even when they weren't being threatened with anything like their lives. So it shows that it possibly argues that anyone could succumb to obedience, to authority. Right, here we go. Research methods question, ethical issues. Milgram was not breaking any official ethical guidelines at the time because none existed. There were no ethical guidelines. It was because of specifically this research and that of Zimbardo a few years later that we learned last lesson that ethical issues became an urgent priority for psychology. Ethical guidelines addresses several issues, including: are participants what from the research? Right to withdraw. The need to get fully what from the participants? What are these ethical issues? The need to get fully informed consent from the participants. The use of what? Deception, and the importance of protecting participants from the risk of harm, psychological harm or harm. Identify how each of these ethical issues arose in Milgram's study. So, Milgram's researchers managed to cover all 4 ethical issues. Right to withdraw. Some participants found it hard to withdraw because they were being ordered by the experiment to continue giving electric shocks and had to overcome 4 prods. So Milgram would argue, no, they did have the right to withdraw. However, participants say, no, it was too difficult to withdraw from the research. Informed consent. The participants did not give their fully informed consent because they did not know the procedure were involved. This is because several aspects of the procedure were either withheld from them or misrepresented to them, i.e. they were deceived. And that brings us on to deception. The participants were deceived because the allocation of roles was fixed. It was not random. The naive, real participant was always going to be the teacher, and Mr. Wallace was always going to be the learner. The electric shocks were fake. Mr. Wallace was a Confederate and not a genuine participant, and it was not a piece of research on memory, as they were told, to see if people remember things. It was a piece of research on obedience to authority. Finally, protecting participants from harm. Most participants experienced some anxiety and some experienced a great deal. In fact, this was one of Milgram's arguments for the validity of his procedures, that the participants believed it was real, so the procedure was at least potentially psychologically harmful. And that is Milgram's obedience study findings. That's what he found. 65% of participants went all the way to the highest voltage, 450 volts. They obeyed authority. Let's discuss and evaluate Milgram's obedience study. What are some of the strengths and what are some of the limitations? Of course, ethical issues. The participants in the study were deceived, e.g. they thought that the shocks were real. Milgram dealt with this by debriefing participants afterwards. Baumrind felt this deception could have serious consequences for participants and researchers, e.g. no informed consent possible. You can't be fully informed if you haven't been told the true aims of the study. Therefore, researchers can damage the reputation of psychologists and their research in the eyes of the public. So this is a limitation. Secondly, Milgram's study lacked internal validity. Orn and Holland argued that participants guessed that the electric shocks were fake, so they were play acting. This is supported by Perry's discovery that only half of the participants believed the shocks that they were given, the learner, were real. This suggests that participants may have been responding to demand characteristics and questions the validity or the genuineness of the results. So people have questioned it. This is a limitation because they're saying that the study lacks internal validity. It is not truly genuine. However, replications have supported Milgram's findings. In a French TV documentary game show, contestants were paid to give fake electric shocks when ordered by the presenter to other participants or actors. 80% gave the maximum 460 volts to an apparent unconscious man. Their behaviour was like that of Milgram's participants, e.g. many signs of anxiety. This supports Milgram's original findings about obedience to authority. This is supporting research. Somebody else has done the study and they found similar results. So that supports Milgram's findings. Can you summarize each of the evaluative points into your own words? And if you can summarize it into exactly 10 words, that's going to challenge you. And there we go. There's the third learning objective ticked off. And there we go. That was lesson 4, obedience. Milgram's research, 1963 research into obedience to authority. Next lesson is lesson 5. We're going to have a look at obedience to situational variables. Well done, my neo-psychologists. My name is Mr. Neo. God bless and peace.
I'm feeling like Will, I feel like a prince, I'm feeling myself. I'm loaded with bills, cause I wasn't blessed with no Uncle Phil. Don't know how it feels, I wanted to flex, they told me to chill. I'm making a flip, my life is a flick, now load up the film.